first one leads me to say a big thank you to our friends from the Consulate and from the Embassy, who as always have helped us with the publicity of this event. And I particularly want to thank Helena, I'm sure she's here somewhere, though I can't see her, the Consul, for kindly letting us use these lovely facilities. And it's really tremendous that we've been able to do that. The second reason why I'm sure that there are so many people here tonight is because of our speaker, Professor Malcolm Deas. I don't have the personal pleasure of knowing Malcolm over a number of years, but like many of you, I know very well of his reputation as an outstanding academic and historian, specialising, but by no means only covering this area, in Colombia in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. And Professor Deas was for many years a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford, and also St Anthony's, a director of the Latin American Centre in Oxford, and of course in those positions will have influenced countless young people by teaching them and counselling them through their studies. And people in this country have not been the only ones to be fortunate in that, because Professor Deas also has an honorary doctorate from the Universidad de los Andes, and therefore also has given summer courses in that particular university. So many people have benefited from that particular experience. Some people perhaps might be content with the wonderful academic career that Professor Deas has had, but our guest tonight is no armchair academic, if I may say. He rolls his sleeves up, and one of the things that he was very much involved in was during the presidency of President Gaviria. And during that time, he was a member of the Consejería de Seguridad y Defensa. And probably from that time as well, he was honoured with the Cruz de Boyacá. As you all know, that's a great honour for a Colombian, let alone for somebody from outside of the country. And not only, I think, Malcolm, Colombia is where you received honours, but also in the United Kingdom as an OBE, and I think in Ecuador and in Venezuela also. So we are delighted to have our guest with us tonight, and thank you very much indeed for making the journey tonight in these difficult conditions. And then finally, the third reason why I'm sure we have so many people here tonight is because of the subject, which is dear to all of our hearts. All of us who love Colombia and have seen Colombia now prosper over the last years really desire to see peace at last for the people who live there. And we know how difficult that is to achieve. Just think about our own United Kingdom, how many years it took to achieve peace in Northern Ireland, and some would say that there's still a way to go as far as that's concerned. So it's a subject that's hugely interesting to all of us, and so without further ado, I will hand you over to Professor Malcolm Deas. Thank you for coming.
It still works?
Yes.
And you can all hear me?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm thank you for your very generous introduction. And I'm sure that most of you, I hope most of you are here because of the interest in the subject, i.e. in the prospects of the present peace negotiations. Still working?
Yes.
I'm technologically backward. What I called my talk is, I think the subject that got issued was why it is difficult to make peace in Colombia and why it is perhaps possible. That is, I hope, what you all received. Good. And what I'm going to do is I've been trying to organize my ideas on these large sheets of paper. I use large sheets of paper in the hope that one idea might connect with another. You never know. And I'm going to start by running through difficulties, and I will then run through possibilities. I find it always very difficult to, still after years and years, find it difficult to make up my mind about many things Colombian. And this talk isn't offered in any sort of dogmatic fashion. It's speculative, necessarily speculative, because none of us know what's going to happen. I hope to conclude on a moderately optimistic but sober note. I hope that I shall leave enough time for people to utter their opinions. Here we go. Why is it difficult? Well, the first thing I would like to emphasize, or what I would first like to emphasize, is the dimensions of the problem. In most elemental manner. Colombia still has, and I'm focusing very much on the Havana talks and the FARC. I'm going to try not to talk about all the problems of Colombia. I want to focus on this particular problem. The dimensions. Colombia still has, I don't know, the FARC is still somewhere around 10,000. The ELN somewhere perhaps around 2,000. Depends whose figures you look at, doesn't that? Gives you a certain idea. How many supporters do the FARC have? Well, you know, if you think of their friends and relations, if you think of their chain of logistics, if you think of all, if you like, the penumbra of the FARC, then you're going to get up to 6 figures. Even in the inquestors, people mention the inquestors, they say, oh, look, the FARC have only 2%. I won't dwell on how sceptical one should be about inquestors, but 2% of 46 million people is quite a lot of people. I mean, as far as I know, doing the arithmetic, you're getting up to 500,000, perhaps, perhaps getting on for 1 million. Now that may be it is a small minority who are either sympathetic to or under the domination of the FARC, but it's a substantial number of people. And there are, people make the comparison here in England very frequently with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a tiny problem in its dimensions compared to the Colombian problem. It's a tiny little part of Ireland. It's, I don't know, something like the size of, is it as big as Cundinamarca? I haven't had time to look up. But it was small. Again, the number of active Provost IRA persons at the end of, by the time of the 1990s, that sort of thing, they were reduced to those who were capable of action were perhaps less than 100 people. We also had very efficient police, very efficient army there. And you know how long, how difficult all that was. The dimensions of Colombia are quite different. It's also, let's look at the nature of the guerrillas. The FARC, as you all know, have a very long history. To be a guerrilla gang, you can easily to official foundation date 1964, you can shut it back beyond that. This is a very, very old organization. It has a very long history, and it is very, very conscious of its history. If you read FARC stuff, if you read just the speech of Marilanda or many of the things that the FARC write, there's a great deal of consciousness of that history. And the history is, we are part of the history of this country. We are an organization that has survived for 4 or 5 decades. Our survival and our growth is in itself a great achievement. They're going to demand a degree of recognition as part of the history of the country. I think it's inevitable. This is a proud guerrilla, and it's the senior guerrilla of the hemisphere. It's also, much bigger, much longer lasting than its rivals. It puts the ELN in the shade, let alone the M19 and the other little guerrillas who made peace in the late 1980s, 1990s. It's also got a great deal of discipline, still. It derives that discipline from, if you like, the old Moscow Line Communist Party, but these people who know how to organize, they know how to obey, they know how to give orders. They're also autonomous. The FARC have never depended on outside help. It's quite a contrast with, the FMLN in Salvador, or the Central, other guerrillas elsewhere. The FARC are Colombian, Their resources are Colombian. They've never depended on the Soviet Union or Cuba. The Cubans have, incidentally, as I would stress, the Cubans have long disapproved of the armed struggle in Colombia. The FARC don't give much of a damn about that. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the FARC's conclusion was one of the, I think, Jacobo Arenas' conclusion was that Gorbachev was a CIA agent. And so, to hell with them. You know, this did not, no doubt it posed them certain internal problems, etc., etc. But it was, I wish to stress, you know, this is a very autonomous lot, and they're not, therefore, easily influenced by you know, no foreigners have any great leverage over them. There's also, as you all know, this is guerrillas with large resources. They have the resources for drugs, which, you know, drugs require large illegal regions which the FARC provides, and the FARC certainly have derived a pretty good income from that. They're not, mind you, entirely by any means dependent on drugs. They're also now getting very good income from mining. They're getting a very good income from, or they have been for many years, got a substantial income from the state itself through deviating the resources of municipalities which they control. They also, as you all know, for a long, long time, they derived large sources from, large sums from kidnapping. Kidnapping was also the sanction which provided leverage for all sorts of extortions. I.e., they still, even though their resources have been considerably diminished recently, they're still not short, if you like, of you know, several, they're not short of resources. Then you have the geography of the country, which you're all familiar with. The Uribe governments, the two Uribe parents, and the offensive against the FARC from sort of 2002 onwards, was, I think, very successful, and quite rapidly successful in, if you like, driving the FARC out of the central part of the country. I.e., if you sort of draw a line between Bogotá, Bucaramanga, Barranquilla, Cartagena, Medellin, Cali, Popayán, etc., where most of the people are and where most of the economy is, the FARC were, I think, fairly effectively and very rapidly expelled from that central part of the country. The other more peripheral reasons are much tougher, and they still have frontiers of refuge. Venezuela, the Venezuelan frontiers, as you can imagine, for all sorts of guerrillas, to have a country, a border that you can skip across for rest and recreation and supplies and this and that and the other. And even if President Chavez has told you not to come to the office for a bit, it's still very, very useful to have a frontier like Venezuela. And at any given time, substantial numbers of the FARC have been in Venezuela. Some of the FARC leadership is almost permanently in Venezuela. This is a great asset. Ecuador, somewhat less so, but again, Ecuador, it appears from the southern supply point of view, has been very useful from the FARC's point of view. And they also have shown a great deal of, in their military capacity, they are capable of adaptations. They've met, you know, the offensive of the armed forces, the Plan Colombia, the Plan Patriotica, with a certain degree of resilience and flexibility. They're still there. Incidentally, those who criticize President Uribe by sort of saying Uribe said they were all finished, Uribe never said they were all finished. Uribe said that they were still going to be a substantial problem. We believe that for later on. They have, I think, from what would people sort of, I think, somewhat exaggeratedly referred to as the sort of war of position, which the FARC were capable of waging in the mid-late 1990s. They have, I think, retreated something like 2 stages. Most of what they do nowadays are small-level attacks, snipings, bombs by the sides of the roads, attacks on minor ambushes, that sort of thing. And, but they're still, as you can do, you know, they're still there, and their military capacity is still quite considerable. I saw also a film the other day in which there was a chap in FARC carrying around a ground-to-air missile. My defective espionage says, well, they may have some of these, but they may not yet have learned how to use them. But the same source told me that eventually they may learn how to use them, and if they did have a substantial number of ground-to-air missiles, that would be a big military headache for the Colombian government, whose successes recently have been in a way quite dependent on air superiority and on the capacity for rapid reinforcement in that way. So it isn't in that sense all over. Right. Okay, most of that is probably well enough known to you, but I think it's worth stressing, that this is still a unit, this is still, those dimensions of the problem one does have to bear in mind. Sometimes when I talk to English audiences, I get the impression that, I've used the phrase before, but I'll use it again, that some people seem to think that the FARC are sort of lightly armed NGO. This is not what they're like. So, if you have that illusion in your mind, remove it. What I'd like to go on about a bit is something which I think gets less said, and that is to sort of speculate about this, okay, the internal psychological and cultural aspects of the FARC. And these things, I think, are aspects of many other insurgencies, but certainly I think they apply to the FARC. And this makes for difficulties. It's very, very hard for, what I'm going to elaborate on is why it is hard for guerrillas to give up. The aim of the FARC has been to take power. Again, this is what you would Colombians call perhaps a perogrullada, something rather obvious, banal. But people don't recognize that. People think, no, that the FARC have a program, that the FARC wants certain things which, if the government conceded, that would be, so to speak, okay. It isn't really like that. If you read, for example, and it's surprisingly few people did read these things, when they published the hard disk of Raul Reyes, the FARC communications which were captured when Reyes was killed over the Ecuadorian border. There's nothing in those emails about a program. This is strictly military and logistical and financial stuff, with a bit of diplomacy thrown in, is Chavez going to come through or not, etc., etc. Programs, the FARC aren't very programmatic, and there are good reasons for this. This is not irrational on their part. What the FARC have said in essence is that when people say, well, what's your program? FARC response has been to say, our program, we're not the people who write the program. We are the armed brazo armado, sorry, it sounds bad in English, the armed arm of the people. We're the people's arm, and we will take power, and then the people will decide what they want. Now that is a skillful thing for the FARC to say, because one of the things it does is it eliminates argument. If we have a program, people criticize it. And they say, oh, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that. The FARC, if you look deeply, you can find the FARC do have sort of 10 points, and there is a sort of Walt Disney type agrarian reform program which nobody ever reads. I shouldn't think one Colombian in 1,000 could repeat the 10 points of the FARC. I certainly couldn't myself, nor I should think could quite a lot of members of the FARC. But it isn't about the program. It was about, for a long, long time, it's about taking power. And there's plenty of evidence for that. You can read stuff written by Maradona. We are going to take power. We are a revolutionary army. The absence of a program is functional, because if there's no program, there's no argument about it. There's no internal argument in the guerrilla. When the FARC did produce, in the time of the Caguan, they did produce at one point some sort of sketchy economic program. All the economists I know, including the economists, the left-wing economists in the Universidad Nacional, said this is rubbish. This is a route map for leading us to poverty. This is all rubbish. And the FARC very soon didn't soft pedal that. It isn't about program, it's about power. And this basically leads me on to one of the difficulties. I'm going on about difficulties, I hope. For the leadership of a movement which has been aiming at that, and beyond that is the utopia of the new Colombia, which, like all utopias, is deliberately left vague. Social justice, people this, people that, no detail. To abandon that aim and settle for something less is an enormous step. Just as, if you like, taking up the Irish parallel, for Jerry Adams and McGuinness to settle for power sharing in little old Northern Ireland where they could be Minister of Education or this or that and the other. It's an enormous step down from, if you like, their romantic view of a united and semi-socialist Ireland, which was, for a long time the fuel of the, so coming down to ground, settling for less than the big dream is a big step, and it's a big step for any guerrilla to make, and there are further complications in that line. Because if you ask yourself, what maintains the coherence and the discipline of the FARC? The answer is conflict. It's the fact that conflict goes on, which means that, right, you have to obey orders, you form our feelers, you don't argue, you obey. The FARC isn't necessarily, like any other, is a pretty authoritarian organisation. It is not a debating society. It has its hierarchy, and orders come from the top down. And discipline is strict, because in any military organisation, discipline has to be strict. Conflict maintains the political and military discipline of the guerrilla. No conflict, and people begin to say, what's going to happen? There's inevitably going to be then argument. Where are we going? What's the direction? And also, people I've talked to about this say, I talked to people in, for example, Herkin with the novelist, who Salvador, head of the FMLN, he said that when peace is on the cards, everybody begins to ask themselves, what's going to happen to me? What's my particular personal destiny? And that makes it extremely difficult to maintain the coherence and discipline of the organisation. So it's conflict that maintains coherence and discipline. More than that, the conflict justifies the guerrillas' domination of the territories in which their influence is predominant. You people have got to obey us because there's a war on. We have a right to control your behaviour, control your movements, etc., because this is military necessity. That disappears. More important, perhaps, is that the flow of resources is also dependent on the conflict. If you have, for example, and this was why the truce, which started under Belisario Betancourt years and years ago in the 1980s, broke down, the FARC went on kidnapping. They said they were not going to kidnap, but they went on kidnapping. If you have a truce, if you have a peace, there's certain things you can't do. You cannot, you can't kidnap, for example. A government cannot tolerate a truce with a guerrilla organisation that is still kidnapping people. A government cannot tolerate a truce with a guerrilla organisation which is still extorting, which is still engaged in illegal drug trafficking. If peace breaks up, there are lots of things that the guerrilla cannot do. And its resources depend on the existence of conflict. And as I mentioned, as peace approaches, everybody thinks about what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to me. I'm going to have to leave the family of the family of the guerrilla is going to disappear, and I therefore, what am I going to do? There's also, of course, the other inhibiting factor is that you can't expect organizations like this, like the Irish again, you can't expect them to go fast. Any leader who is, who shows himself as being too keen on making an early peace is obviously going to put himself in a position of jeopardy with those who disagree. This man is a traitor, this man is, he's giving up. What do we do to him? Well, the results of excessive enthusiasm for an early peace might quite easily be fatal. Imagine, because discipline in the FARC is maintained by, severe methods. People are shot. Right. You also, that's, this is going about, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the FARC leadership to some degree, and to think, again, sorry. No, he raised his hand. I thought, not to interview, please. There's some convulsive movement. You also wonder, there is an enormous degree, as I'm sure many of you recognize, there's an enormous degree of mistrust between the sides engaged. The mistrust of the FARC. I remember thinking of a couple of things like when Victor Ricardo was ambassador here, and I had talked to him a bit about his experiences in Kaiwan, talking to the FARC. And he told me two interesting things I remember from that conversation. One was that on one day, he'd actually got the FARC to agree to something. There was some minor agreement on how to do what in Kaiwan, where to meet or something, and there'd been a disagreement, and he used all his powers of persuasion to persuade the FARC round to his point of view on some not very important procedural point. And he found that after that, for several days, they looked at him with a far more intense mistrust. And this mistrust was produced by the fact that he got them to agree to something. This meant that he was a dangerous man. The other thing I remember him saying was, when I asked him, well, how did the FARC define the oligarchy? And his response was, Paras FARC, todo lo que no es FARC es oligarquía. And that, again, you can take that with a pinch of salt. But these are not, the real mistrust, in the degree of mistrust. And of course, the FARC's alibi for mistrust, and sometimes some degree more than alibi, is what happened to the Union Patriotica. When you recall, the Union Patriotica was the political arm of the FARC, created under in time of Belisario Benca, 1980s. The FARC went on fighting. The Unidad Popular, Union Patriotica, sorry, was the political arm of an active guerrilla. And as the political arm of an active guerrilla was bumping off people at a fairly good rate. It was not behaving in any innocent fashion. And in those circumstances, that particular, if you like, tactic was not viable because the people massacred the Union Patriotica. I think there was a good deal of bad faith there. I think a lot of the hardliners in the FARC were not particularly dismayed that the Union Patriotica got bumped off. The one can go who did what to whom. I think the chief culprits were the narcos. There was certainly a good deal of connivance with the armed forces in that thing. And the FARC from then on sort of say, look, we cannot possibly, to ask us to at least remember what happened to the Union Patriotica. The political move, the politics of that sort is not viable. Now, I think there's a great deal of difference between the current situation, the current prospects of the Marcha Patriotica, which, if you like, nowadays, in the last year or so, has been, if you like, the heir of the Union Patriotica. I don't think it is necessarily the case that the massacre of the Union Patriotica is going to be repeated, especially if peace is made. What is not sustainable is to have a political movement ostensibly aligned with the FARC when the FARC is still an active guerrilla, because that would produce paramilitarism. People won't tolerate that. People say, look, how do you expect us to tolerate these people when their armed backers are doing what they're doing to our lot? I think that, I hope that that's clear. I can elaborate more on why I think that. That doesn't mean I come back to this when I get onto my column of why things may be possible. But anyway, and those points about why it's difficult, I do wish to sort of stress those points about why, all those enormous difficulties which a guerrilla faces in adapting. But sort of usually, if things aren't superb, if things are going more or less well, the obvious thing to do is carry on. That's the easy solution. Because people get used to guerrilla life, they're very good at it. It has its routine. You spend most of the time thinking about breakfast, lunch, dinner, moving the tents, this, that, and the other. It's very demanding. You don't have all that much time for worrying. You have to spend most of your time engaged in the business, if you like, of sort of day-to-day survival. But, yeah, anyway, frequently the easiest solution is carry on. Then you don't have to question the dream. You can always say, oh, well, the political situation may change. Chavez may help us. Reed, Bear and Santos may murder each other. There are whole lots of ways in which you can justify sort of keeping on, because that's what you've been doing for years and years. And there's sort of, they tend to admit to say, no, we're going to abandon the arms struggle, and we're going to change our, if you like, our capital, which we've accumulated through this method of struggle, for a different sort of political capital. That is a great step and a difficult step. Yeah. Yeah, on the government side, a bit more about distrust. Of course, after the Taiwan, the president of the FARC's conduct in Taiwan, and the advantages that the FARC got out of that, FARC's reputation for insincere negotiation, for using negotiation as a mere tactic to get, to relieve the pressure, to get more publicity, etc., etc., etc. There are a great many reasons why, on the other side, the FARC inspires mistrust, quite apart from the other things the FARC inspires. But okay, now to shift on a bit to political difficulties. All agreements, any agreement made, any peace agreement, has to be acceptable to the large majority of Colombians. I say this, but I'm sure Colombians here will realize that, but sometimes, speaking to an English audience, you get people thinking, I get the impression people think that the trouble is that the government isn't making enough concessions. They have a view that it's possible for the Colombian government to make all sorts of concessions to the FARC, and nothing will happen, if you like, on the other side. This isn't the case. They're very strict, I think. There are lots of limitations on how much the Colombian government can offer. One can speculate about this. In a democracy, in a country which aspires to be a democracy, you cannot, for example, say we're going to, one of the things which the phrase comes up, and has come up in there's current writings about these discussions, the actual discussions, should we discuss el modelo económico? And a democracy cannot discuss the modelo económico with 6 guerrilla leaders. It's not feasible. The modelo económico has to emerge out of the, if you like, the normal semi-democratic processes of the country. The ELN, which, as you know, for years and years lived by blowing up a pipeline, used to think that that gave them some sort of divine right to define the petroleum policy of Colombia, because they were so expert in blowing up a pipeline. No serious country can hand over its energy policy to people who blow up pipelines. No serious country can say, right, in order to make peace with the father, we're going to sort of say what the economic model of the country is going to be from now on. It just isn't real politics. Also, one notices that I think if one looks at the peace processes under Patriotica, if you look at the Caravana, you'll find that governments which appear to be incoherent, appear to be conceding too much. What happened on both those occasions is you get the birth and then the growth of paramilitarism. You get people who say, look, this government's lost its way. It's handing over to these bandits. It's ceding too much. We're not going to have that. We're going to produce our own de facto resistance to that. These are things, again, which happened in Northern Ireland, which are not usually sort of mentioned in the more sort of, if you like, sanitized accounts of the Northern Ireland peace process, but it's a real element in the equation. Another thing is that excessive peacemaking doesn't in the past seem to produce greater peace. If you look at the figures, you will find, that, for example, the high points of recent violence were under the Pastrana government, Andres Pastrana. That's when you had most kidnappings, most displacements, most attacks on pueblos, etc., etc. Because I'm not blaming, please don't think that I'm blaming Pastrana. I think that all these governments I haven't time to go into the rationale of each particular period, because I think there are many things that one can say in favour of Pastrana. Just I think there are many things one can say in favour of Uribe, and I've said it. And I think there are many things one can say in favour of Santos. I find that the Colombian pension, or at least the pension of some Colombian journalists, who keep saying that X is a presidential villain, and you find this even among, I'm afraid, intelligent Bogota journalists and columnists, those of you who read, and I always read Claudia Lopez, and some people here read Claudia Lopez. Well, we had Claudia Lopez saying, that everything wrong was due to Uribe, etc., etc. And what happened 2 weeks ago? Everything wrong was due to Santos. And this, came like that. But going back to what I was going to say, it's naive to think that, if you like, poorly managed peacemaking reduces the level of violence in the country. That's not the case. But anyway, we've gone on with politics, and I wonder, okay, now we're going to be even more political. As I was saying, any peace agreement has to be acceptable to the majority of Colombians if it's going to work. It isn't, the government has to keep that always in mind. There is considerable opposition to the current peace, the questioning of the current peace negotiations, and particularly from President Uribe. What do I think about that? Well, I thought a lot about that, not come to any frightfully sort of firm conclusion. Uribe continues to enjoy a pretty high level of popularity, especially outside Bogota. Uribe was never popular in Bogota. He didn't go to cocktails, he didn't batter up journalists, he was too paisa, and he wasn't even a very okay paisa. So, forget that. But Uribe was extremely popular in the provinces, remains very popular in Antioquia, and he remains very high in the encuestas. Uribe is sort of pretty solid in the encuestas. I think that President Santos, who is a figure who inspires perhaps less sort of, visceral loyalty, and at the same time less visceral hostility. Santos in the encuestas, I think, sort of like a yo-yo. He goes up and down quite easily. Sometimes he's up, sometimes he's down. Uribe is a somewhat polarizing figure, but remains solidly pretty high. But then at the same time, peace is popular. So one has a paradox of Uribe suddenly maintains a pretty good degree of popularity. Uribe also maintains, if you like, a firm grip on the issue of security. That's his issue. And security is popular. Don't have any illusions about that. Why was Uribe so popular for so long? Because he promised security, to which to a certain degree he also delivered. But peace is also popular. Peace is more popular than Uribe. Uribe is a politician who, again, is very keen on popularity. So what exactly Uribe is going to do in the face, if you like, of a successful peace accord, I'm not sure. Watch this space. Uribe is also a politician capable of audacity and surprise. I also thought, when I was thinking again in Northern Ireland, how did Northern Ireland end up? Well, it all ended up with Mr. McGuinness and Mr. Paisley in the same office, practically. Nobody thought that was going to happen. What happened in Northern Ireland was the two extremes got in place, if you like, and the poorer, worthy people in the centre have momentarily or temporarily departed the scene. Politics is unpredictable stuff. I don't think that Uribe, again, is I think Uribe, if you like, has very strong feelings about FARC leadership. I don't think he has such strong feelings about the FARC rank and file. There, again, I'm going to come back to that particular point. But anyway, going on with difficulties. I've studied, as far as I've read several times the Havana Accord. I have a copy of it with everybody's signatures on it. And they signed every page, and then they initialed every page. And it's a very well hammered out document. I'm very much in favour of it as a document. This is a document, again, strictly related, except with perhaps one major exception. It's a document strictly related to ending the conflict. One of its merits is that it isn't about, fantasies of the new Colombia. It's got a certain amount of rhetoric inevitably about that sort of thing, but it's basically about how we're going to end conflict, which is what it should be about. But it has one element in it which stands out a bit, and one thinks, oh my gosh, how are they going to manage this? And this is the big question of the future of rural Colombia, the future of the agro, which, as some of you who've been following these things may know, there was a great convention in Bogota in December, late December, where people got together and more than 1,000 people issued 600 suggestions which were sent to Havana about what should be the future of rural Colombia. And rural Colombia is, as you know now, if you like, is the dwelling place of a minority of Colombians. The country is no longer anything like as rural as it used to be. But a lot of the problems which make for the conflict are in rural Colombia, and without without plans to reform and to produce a new rural Colombia, then yes, well, that's something that has to be done. I say it stands out a bit in the document because the document says, no, we're not going to discuss the Modelo Económico, we're not going to discuss the utopian future Colombia, but we are going to discuss the future of the agro, we're going to discuss the future of rural Colombia. I think that was an inevitable concession that the government had to make to the FARC. I myself am sceptical about the degree to which the FARC is an agrarian movement. I think the FARC is a movement which is still very campesino, if you like. Most of the rank and file are small-town rural Colombians. Its origins, of course, are rural. It had, I think, greater claims in its origins to be an agrarian movement than it has now. I think, for example, I think that very few members of the FARC really want to be campesinos. from what one knows, there have been a certain amount of inquiries as to, okay, if you're not, with people demobilized and people captured, so what you want to be. Not many of those people, of the guerrillas, want to be rural workers. So I would say it's campesino, yes, and it's rural in other senses, but is it an agrarian movement? I have my doubts about that. But anyway, in these things, people are, one should swallow one's doubts to some degree. It's inevitable, I think, that this was on the agenda. What do I find out? I thought, anyway, that I would come back to this question when I go down my column of possibilities. But obviously there are great possible bones of contention there. And then there are the other items of agreed discussion, many of which are complicated. But and I'll just sort of go through them quickly, because I think that they're all of them, in a way I can imagine ways in which they are soluble. One is, if you like, the extension of democracy and the provision for some sort of democratic participation by some sort of version of a demobilized FARC. I don't think the FARC will be able to keep, if you like, the trademark. I don't think Colombia will tolerate a little movement called FARC. But you have the March of Patriotica, you have a lot of other organizations, and changing the label doesn't mean that that I think is possible. And that is obviously on the cards, and it has to be there has to be there, if you like, considerable concessions. These, I think, it's possible to imagine. It's possible to think of ways in which if you like, a slice of the political action can be awarded to a demobilized FARC. It's not impossible. There's the question of their security. Again, difficult, but I think possible. What in the 19th century people used to call guarantees. That is, you're not going to be assassinated, you're going to, etc., etc. I think there again, I think there's a difference between vis-a-vis the rank and file and vis-a-vis the leaders. But anyway, one can come back to that. Then there are all those questions which delight academics. And it's such a relief to be talking to a non-academic audience, because if it was an academic audience, one would have to go on and on about transitional justice, which is the largest academic growth industry I can remember in recent years, and produces more air tickets to more international conferences than anything else going at the moment. There's then the questions of memory. Intellectuals love these things, memory, memory. And when one says, look, there are lots of memories. I will tell you a story about that. I was at a thing in the Andes about the Frente Nacional, which was the agreement to share power between the Liberals and the Conservatives in 1957, 58. And there was a panel of Liberals and Conservatives. And the Liberals are, veterans of those distant struggles. And I remember the Liberals all sorts of behaved very badly and said everything was the fault of the Conservatives, that the Liberals were entirely innocent, that the whole thing with Godos, the wicked lot, etc., and foreign Conservatives weren't allowed to say anything. And at the end, they all started saying about, when I was trying to chair this, it was one of those impossible occasions which I failed to control. And they went on about memory, and I said, but look, there are lots of people who have memories. There are conservative memories as well as liberal memories. And I remember one of the liberal ladies getting up and raising a finger and saying, La memoria es nuestra. These things are difficult. And again, what you have in these is you see that some people wish to win the peace, and they wish to win the arguments. And you won't get peace if you insist on winning the arguments. You won't get the peace if you insist that la memoria es nuestra and all that. But anyway, they'll work all these things out. And as for truth, well, it's complicated. It's very complicated, but anyway. And then there's a question more tricky than all that. There's a question of impunity. I'll give you another thing, figures from the Inquester. The was an inquest that, I may have mentioned, 70% of Colombians, this was back in August when the Havana talks were announced, 70% of Colombians were in favour of the peace talks. Substantial vote in favour. 78% were in favour of the leaders of the FARC receiving some sort of castigo. The leaders of the FARC say, not a day in prison. You know, and what's going to happen there? And also academics and lawyers, and as you know, Colombia is full of lawyers, one of the countries most full of lawyers that you can come across. And the lawyers love, you know, they love theories of transitional justice, and they love also, you know, the human rights people say there's the International Court of Justice. Colombia has signed up to the International Court of Justice. If these people are not sufficiently punished, if the victims are not given sufficient reparation, then to the ICJ, you know. Oh dear, oh dear. I think the Colombian government, if there's any members of it here, it is rather prone to sign up to things without thinking. You know, if it looks like a sort of okay international agreement, Colombia will sign it. And then they think, oh my God, you know, we've signed something which perhaps is not very convenient. But anyway, what's going to happen there? There are now international standards in these things. What I think will happen is they will fudge it. I think that a lot of fudging is going to have to be done, and I think a lot of fudging is done in all successful peace accords. So anyway, now I'm going to go back to the beginning and rattle through, if you're still tolerant, my feelings about why things are possible. And I will be commenting on what I said earlier about the difficulties. I'll try and do this in a speedy and efficient fashion. And dimensions, the numbers of the FARC. The FARC numbers have been much diminished. Certainly there would be no prospect for these talks without the military pressure that the FARC have been under since 2002. They have been, as I say, expelled from the central core of the country. They have lost a lot of leaders, and this is something that didn't happen before. Previously, I think most FARC leaders thought they would die in their beds, probably well accompanied. The fact that you may, you know, that life has become much more uncomfortable. The FARC have had to be much more mobile. They've lost a lot of intermediate leaders, etc. That certainly, I think, concentrates people's minds. I don't think that I think that particular line of action is now, if you like, exhausted, because it no longer has the impact it did have. When it was Raul Reyes or Alfonso Carlo or Monica Hoy, this had a certain impact, but it doesn't anymore. And the FARC have managed to maintain some sort of coherent structure present, you know. Okay, we won't dwell on too many of these things. I think that Plan Colombia, which was the American assistance in various forms, I think it actually has been remarkably successful. It's very unusual to find an item of American foreign policy which one can regard as a success. But as there are many countries in the world, you know, the chances are that the Americans may have done the right thing somewhere. And I think that the Plan Colombia has been very successful. It's been very discreet. There have been very few scandals attached to it. It has been very effective. It's not been that expensive. Yep. Whether you like it or not, and you know, I usually have the reaction in academic circles in England, how can you possibly defend American military aid to anybody? I'm afraid that academia, yeah, well, I won't go on by that. Anyway, you know, the US contribution has, I think, been very important in various aspects, and crucial and success. Yeah. Incidentally, the United States supports the Havana talks. The American State Department has no problems with this and hopes that they will succeed, and insofar as it can do anything to help them to succeed, it will do so. And yeah, they may not release, I don't think the Justice Department will release Mr. Simon Trinidad to assist at the talks. But you know, the American government is very difficult to deal with because it's divided into so many different bits, and they all have their different policies. But the State Department and the Defense Department are in favour of a peace deal with FARC. Diminished resources, yeah. Drugs remain strategic, but the drugs don't actually help strategically in every way. Where they are in peripheral parts. The FARC has to spend a lot of time, if you like, looking after those peripheral parts, which are sort of strategically not very strategic. But anyway, so yeah. Yeah, the drug, you know, how the drugs are going to get into this accord. I would just say that the FARC are not a cartel. Some people say, you know, oh, they're all, you know, they're just like, they're just another cartel. They're not a cartel. They take, they certainly make large sums of money out of drugs. But people, you know, narcos do not spend their time wearing rubber boots, tramping around in jungles, or doing the things that the FARC do. And the FARC, although there are some elements in the FARC who've adopted a somewhat narco way of life. I remember Sergio Jaramillo in one of his presentations here showing photographs of some FARC chief who was obviously very keen on expensive horses and refrigerators and was living the life of Riley in one of the fronts. But in general, the FARC is not a union. So, although nothing in this business is going to be perfect, of course, you know, people say, oh, won't the FARC divide? Will they all come in? Well, you know, no, nothing is ever perfect. Some of them will, no doubt, not accept these calls. Some of them will say, well, you know, I prefer the drug industry to making peace as a guerrilla. You know, yeah, but if you can get a substantial number of them to make peace, you have made a substantial gain, and you've made the general problems of the country more soluble. You know, I find this sort of argument of perfection crops up again and again. People say, for example, about Uribe and the paramilitaries, oh, but he didn't demobilise them all. Look at the backroom, some of them still going. Yeah, but he just, you know, he demobilised 2/3 of them. There are certainly many less of them around than there used to be, and they're not behaving as badly as they used to, and there has been certainly a great gain there. And I think, yeah, yeah. So, frontiers of refuge. The international lineup is in favour of the FARC reaching some accord. The Cubans have long been against the armed struggle in Colombia. Some of you may not know, Fidel Castro wrote a whole book saying that it was time that the Colombians abandon the armed struggle and it was not a good idea. A whole book written by Mr. Castro. Strangely, people don't read. I don't know. But he did. The Cubans are a positive help. Also, the Cubans are an enormous help because it's one place in the world where you can have discreet talks. The Duke of Edinburgh, a joke about the Duke of Edinburgh is coming, when he visited Paraguay, he said to have greeted General Stressner, saying, how nice to see you, General. It's so pleasant to be in a country where the press isn't free. The same way goes for Havana. Havana is one place where you can have discreet talks, and the discretion in these talks is very important. One of the reasons why the Caguan didn't work was because of the perpetual show and the endless visitors and the endless diplomats sitting on plastic chairs doing damn all, etc., and the way in which this could be turned into a sort of media fest. You can't do that in Havana. In Havana, you do have a chance of really discreet conversations. And these, if you're going to reach this sort of, if this accord is then going to be, this accord, of course, was produced with complete discretion. And it took, I think, somebody told me, it took something like 70 meetings to get this preliminary accord. It's hard work. And you know, all these negotiations are very, very arduous and difficult because people, you know, for all sorts of reasons. Anyway, but anyway, we've the international lineup. Cubans, okay. The Venezuelans at the moment also are, you know, and that's partly because Uribe had that big set to with Chavez and produced the evidence of the FARC in Venezuela, etc., etc. And the Venezuelans said, oh, then they made peace with Santos and all that, you know, etc. The Venezuelans are sort of, if you like, more or less on board. I don't think the Venezuelans are necessarily capable of controlling what goes on that front end, but they're on board. They think, again, that their interest is, you know, the old days in which Chavez was toying with supporting the FARC over. You also have, I think, a very discreet international presence. You do have the Cubans, you have the Chileans, the Norwegians, and the Venezuelans, and that's it. It's quite enough to my mind. People are very vain about that. Everyone loves making peace, and everyone thinks that they've got the sort of big heart and the genius and the intelligence to do it. Peace excites human vanity, and it's best to keep that under control. Anyway, I think also another thing, by going back to this, the dimensions of the military thing, I think the government is quite right not to have a cese de fuego. FARC have announced bilateral cese de fuego and said, oh, the government, but no, it won't work with a cese de fuego. Government has to keep pressure up. Cese de fuego, I think the guerrillas there are actually probably a little bit devious because, as I was saying earlier, what maintains their structure is conflict. Cese de fuego is very, very difficult to design a verifiable and neutral ceasefire. Ceasefires tend to favour one side or the other. The FARC have a very poor record of taking, if you like, military advantage from ceasefires, etc. And they've said, no, we're not. We're going to keep up the military power. And I think that that is necessary. It may be painful, but I think it's correct. Right. Politics in the FARC, what's going on in the minds of the FARC. I try to read between the lines of the statements the FARC make. I read Mr. Timoshenko's speech, I read the stuff that comes out. I think that my conclusion is, again, is that the FARC are serious. I'm not sure, I don't know if they know exactly what the outcome is going to be, but certainly there has been a shift in FARC rhetoric, which does, if you like, sort of, if you read it closely, it's about making peace. It's not about taking power anymore. You know, there is a difference between, if you read, say, Marulanda, even 5 or 6 years ago, before he died, and you read what the FARC are issuing now, there is a shift. Going on about the, where are we now? I was going to say something about why the government wants to make peace, but that's, I think, fairly obvious. I don't know, we can talk more about that, but I don't think one should be too cynical about it. The country, obviously, you know, does feel that, you know, the old days where you could simply get by only governing certain parts of it, and the rest could go hang. This is no longer sustainable if the country is going to have the future it deserves. And you know, any government faced with the sort of problems the conflict produces, the enormous number of displaced people, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, we can skip that bit. I think I've already mentioned most of the things I've got down in this column. I think, wait a moment. Yeah, one point I know, yes, I think I've already mentioned that. Yes, going back to the land question, I read also what the FARC have said about that, and what do I think? give you my brief resume of my thoughts on that. It's very complicated and problematic because Colombia, rural Colombia, is very varied. It has an enormous geographical diversity, enormous economic diversity. It's very, very difficult to think, you know, this is the solution, or, you know, this is the way forward for all rural Colombia, because it's a very varied country. It isn't a country, again, where you can reduce the problem to, if you like, campesinos who want more land, latifundistas who've got too much land. Therefore, you know, very, very soon, I think, if you study it up, you escape from that sort of simplicity. That's not to say that, you know, that among the 650 suggestions that this agrarian meeting sent to Havana, some of them may make sense. The one organisation that was not present in this meeting about the agrarian future of the country were the ganaderos. Fedigan refused to turn up. And the head of the premier of the cattlemen said, no, 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 I'm not going to. I can see in some ways why. It wasn't exactly a very neutral organisation. And beyond that, if you like, the worst bad blood probably exists between the cattlemen and the farm. Fedigan published a book a couple of years ago, the Historia de la Ganadería, one that's on history of cattle in Colombia. It had an appendix. The appendix was about 15, 20 pages, a very small print, where they listed all the cattlemen who'd been murdered by the FARC and all the cattlemen who'd been kidnapped by the FARC. It's a pretty impressive list. The numbers are very, very high. Cattle was, if you like, the sort of first port of call for FARC extortion. You know, the original Bolitero, the vacuna, was like, you've got cattle, you pay up. Otherwise, you know, we will kidnap you or kill your cattle or kill your mayordomo, etc., etc. You know, Fedigan says no. But reading again the FARC's agrarian pronouncements, I did not see, I don't see myself an inseparable distance between what the FARC say they want, which again is largely in common places. You know, it's not a detailed agrarian plan. It is not. It is largely about, yes, we want, you know, we want a more equitable distribution of land. We want more technical assistance to sustainable campesino enterprises, etc., etc. A lot of the things that the FARC say are perfectly compatible with what the government has already said that it intends to do. My scepticism is that I think that the capacity of any Colombian government to do these things seems to me to be quite limited, partly because the rural Colombia is in, if you like, in an unstudied and fairly chaotic and still in very insecure state. But I don't see that there is there an incompatibility. I think there are lots of deals that can be done. I think also the FARC has something of a rabo de paja in this respect. FARC's record in the countryside is far from being, if you like, generally innocent. The FARC has engaged in, you know, considerable land grabs themselves. The FARC is certainly not universally popular with campesino Colombia, which tends to behave in, if you like, some prudential fashion. So I don't actually see there that there is any deep incompatibility. I think the, you know, accords could conceivably be reached. I think it's possible, if you like, that the FARC can have an input into agrarian policy, but I don't think the FARC have a claim to, if you like, determine it and control all its aspects. Ending up, and I'm going to end up, about the actual procedure. A great many things, you know, one could say really out there. Trying not to be encyclopedic. I'd like to end on, as I said, guardedly optimistic note related to the current procedures, which I think are far superior to any previous ones. And as you know, Colombian government's been trying to make peace ever since Julio César Tawai in 1980. That's 33 years of intermittent peacemaking. Why is it superior? One is, I think, the insistence on a limited agenda, i.e., this is a call to make peace. After peace comes politics. After peace, if you like, come all the arguments about the construction of a new Colombia, etc., etc., etc. But those have to be done in a different, those have to be done without shooting. Those have to be a product of, democratic procedures. The insistence on limited agenda, I think, is also essential for this procedure to be accepted by most Colombians. I think if the Santos government had tried, a sort of Caguan type open agenda where everyone participates and everything is on the table, I think the country would have said, no, for God's sake, we don't want to go through that again. It wouldn't have been a possible move. I'm also very much in favour of discretion and the absence of show. And I think that I mentioned the Duke of Edinburgh's compliment to James Stressner. I think that publicity, leaks, show, all that, make things very, very much more difficult. I think the government also has to observe that as well as the guerrillas. I think that everybody, all sides, should stick to that. One positive note there too. The FARC have made, of course, it's bound to happen. The FARC have made their efforts to have a show. To say, look, here, the first speech of Ivan Marquez, which is all about, changing the model and grand social justice, etc., etc., didn't go down at all well. That wasn't in the accord. The presence of the Dutch girl is a bit of an irritant, because she's obviously just there as a sort of bait for naive journalists. I'm sorry, I'm not anti-feminist, but that is the case. Pretty Dutch guerrilla girl, believer in the cause. I'm glad to say that none of this has had very much echo. And there's a great contrast between this process and the Caguan. The Caguan was sort of eternal show. Here we have smiling gorillas and whiskey and, on and on and on. There's been, the reportage of the Havana talks has up to now been very sober. And one doesn't see either that if the FARC thought that this was going to be an occasion on which they would recover the political ground that they very, very much lost with management of the mismanagement of the Caguan and all the things they did then, and all the results of that, they're not getting very far. You don't see in the Colombian press that there's of course considerable interest in what's going on, but the FARC are not having any success in making this into a glamorous platform, which is, I think, a good sign. I would also stress I've already mentioned the very detailed effort that went into producing this. This is produced by really hard-headed and intelligent people who are not improvising. With all their charm, Belisario and Pastrana were not masters of detail. They were not hard-headed. They were frequently sentimental. They were frequently left the girls wide open for their enemies. They were frequently taken advantage of. This is under much, much better control. And I also think that the representativeness of the government team is both important and good. You have an able, coherent team, on which also you have General Mora, which I think is very important, Belisario, those of you with long memory, thought that it was good to have bad relations with the army because it gave you good relations with the guerrillas. No, that is a very, very, yes, mistaken conclusion. And the fact that the army is represented by General Moro, who is the general of most prestige in the Colombian armed forces in the last couple of decades, is very important. So, yeah, also, as I say, few foreigners. I become so slightly nationalist. I don't, well, you know, okay, we had to have the Cubans because they're the hosts, we had to have the Venezuelans because they're on the frontier, and we had to have the Norwegians because none of these things ever happen without a Scandinavian, and we had to have, you know, we balanced that with the Chileans. Okay, because peace has to be made between Colombians, and it is a Colombian matter. And it isn't for foreigners to tell, you know, in the past, the Colombians made peace on many occasions, without foreigners, without academics, without lawyers, and so my conclusion is on that sort of, okay, I have no idea, well, you know, how this is all going to come out, but I think there is at least a prospect of something being agreed, even if it doesn't include everybody and it doesn't solve all the problems, etc., etc., etc. One of my friends, Francisco Gutierrez, Samin, who writes a column in the Spectador, he said, you know, he wrote a column with all the sort of, you know, running through his mind, very intelligent chap, all the sort of limitations, imperfections, and incompleteness of the prospect. But he ended up saying, you know, la prosaica, la pedestre, la simple vida sin guerra tiene su encanto. And that's what I agree with.
We have a fairly limited amount of time because I know people would because people will want to get to trains, etc. But I certainly want to take advantage of Malcolm Deas' invitation for us to raise any questions or any comments on the things that have come forward tonight. So open to anybody who wishes to raise a point. Yes.
Hello. You touched briefly on the drugs, and you did mention that, you know, the FARC is economically diversified. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, you know, the new dynamics of the drug trade. Perhaps to a certain extent the sort of the weight in the economic chain has shifted maybe northwards towards Mexico. Obviously it's very influential. The drugs are a backbone of the guerrillas. Do you have any thoughts, particularly as to what's going to play out or how that influences the reality?
There's still a lot, of course, there's still a lot of drugs in Colombia, and there's still a lot of money in drugs in Colombia, and there's still a, you know, the FARC do dominate certain sectors of the trade, and you know, they are no doubt very aware of how much money there is in this. And so if you put yourself in, you know, in, let's say, a drug-dependent front, and there are some fronts which just do business and don't fight, those people may say, well, look, you know, why should, you know, this peacemaking is all very well, but let's stay in business. That's perfectly possible. In which case they will stay in business. But at the same time, I think that, if you like, the chances for, you know, with an accord with a substantial number of the FARC, or substantial size of the FARC, the country does become more controllable. And there's less, if you like, illegal land in Colombia, or land without law, which is what drug protection needs. So it may not be, you know, it certainly won't solve the drug problem, but it diminishes it from a Colombian point of view. That's about all I'm afraid I haven't got much more to say on that. One hopes that certain Mexican habits won't, which, you know, the Mexican drug scene seems to be more violent than the Colombian. The Colombian has been violent enough in the past. But, well, one hopes that, you know, one has to be, I'm afraid, a bit selfish about these things. Less of a problem for the Colombians, maybe more of a problem for somebody else. And again, you know, I don't, I'm afraid, have a solution to that.
Yes, I'll take one back first because no, you said. Yeah.
Is that me?
Yeah.
I'll stand up because I can't see anything. Thank you for an amazingly perceptive analysis. But I would just like to ask, we've now talked about all the considerations and the arguments and the difficulties and the possibilities. Given those arguments, who do you think has the stronger negotiating team? And do you think that there is sufficient respect from each side to the other to reach a durable peace agreement?
I think they're both strong teams. Of course, I know more about the government team than I know about the FARC team. And well, you know, people say with the FARC, oh, X is a militarista and a hardliner, and Y is this and Y is that. That's very tenuous stuff. I think they're both strong teams on their different sorts. I also think that, it may be the case that they don't know either how the thing will work out. You know, the idea that some people assume that the FARC have gone into this because they have a plan and they're going to stick to their plan. Maybe not. Maybe. I also think, you know, that in intimate argument with the two teams and their backers outside, you know, but in intimate and discreet argument, it may be that people, surprise, surprise, even change their minds a bit. It has happened in the past. It's not, you know, I think, again, for the reasons I set out, this isn't an easy business. But let me put it this way, in teasing, I have in Colombia, believe it or not, some left-wing friends. And I've said to them recently, look, you people don't realize that now you're faced with the opportunity that you've been waiting for all along. You know, I say, look, here we are, sooner or later Colombia is going to have a left-wing government. It is. I don't know when, but it happens in most countries. It'll probably happen to Colombia. I don't know if Colombia's got any sort of particular vaccination that makes. What have you got now? You have a divided establishment. You have President Uribe, slaying of President Santos. You have, therefore, President Uribe says he's going to launch his list for the Senate. You know, it isn't sure that you've got these people, you know, if you like, your enemy is divided. Why don't you produce, you know, make peace? Because if you make peace, then the country will react generously. I remember when the M19 made peace. There was, you know, the M19 was, compared to the FARC, fairly pathetic show, although they had some sort of attractive figures who wore hats and that sort of thing. But then, you know, they got a terrific vote. I think the relief of Colombians, if there was peace with the FARC, would be that the reaction would be, we must be generous. You know, we must recognize these people are part of it, which they are. They're part of the history of the country. They're not just a vulgar gang of bandits. You may dislike what they've done horrible things, but they're not just a lot of bandits. You know, these are people who had a cause. You may not agree with it, but you know, and the rank and file are just like us, which they are. The rank and file of the FARC are, you know, small town peasant youth without much prospects. Nobody, you know, they're not some hate objects. And people say, right, you know, we make peace with people. You've also got, you know, the poor old Colombian left, like Polo and, you know, Mr. Petro and Clara Obregon. Lopez Obradon, pardon, Clara Lopez Obradon, who was for 5 minutes mayor of Bogota, who everyone likes because she's both left-wing and oligarchic. And also she looks more and more like Queen Victoria every day. So why not try and grab, what happens in Colombia if the powers that be, or if the usual winners are divided, you get these surges, like you had with the NAPO in 1970, like you had with Mocos. I once said, you have a real political opportunity. If the FARC, say, right, we're dissolving, here is the Marcha Patriotica. The FARC's technique is going to be, some of my friends say, very much like their model for possible peaceful politics is, what's his name in Bolivia? My name's gone. Evo. What do? You have all sorts of marches and strikes and peasant thises and community that's, etc., etc. Rather like a sort of grand, tropical, nationwide Ken Livingstone, if you get all the distance, into some sort of big wave. Yeah? I mean, it's possible. I think there is if I was in the FARC, I would say this is our last chance too, because, the FARC had lost enormously politically. FARC, they blew it, frankly, with the Caguan. Why was Uribe so popular for so long? Because people were sick of the FARC. They were sick of insecurity. That's, and people, I don't know how people manage to sort of not see this. I mean, partly managed not seeing it by reading Bogota journalists for whom Uribe is the devil, as you know. But they have a real opportunity. And I think also that my line for a long, long time has been that the existence of armed conflict favours the right, has favoured the right for a long time. It's favoured the right, it produces paramilitaries, it produces Parapolitica, it gives if you like, the reactionary elements in Colombia their excuse for, if you like, going on and being reactionary. It restricts the agenda. Governments, again, my lifelong study has led me to conclude that governments can only do about 3 things at once. However sophisticated, even the Scandinavian government, especially if you look at these Danish things on television, they can't do all that many things at once. Now, if one other thing you have to do in Colombia is preoccupy yourself all the time with guerrilla security, that restricts you, not only in resources, which it obviously restricts, although I think that Colombia will has one of the things, which has really changed, is that you now do have a serious security apparatus. I don't mean that in a sinister sense. But with a country like that, with the difficulties it's got, you do need, I'm afraid, a large army and a large police force. And you can whistle for human rights if you haven't got that. It's not going to guarantee them automatically. No. But if you haven't got, if you like, basic control of your territory. Anyway, going back to my other argument, if you have this real political opportunity, I think that, with this opportunity does exist. And I think that the FARC could, if the FARC said, right, this is the end of their Charlie Bala, no more shots. You don't have to sort of get them to surrender, you don't have to get them to give up their arms immediately. The important thing is that the conflict stops. Then you can, in some future year, you can arrange some sort of Irish or Colombian version of that Irish putting the arms beyond use. In Colombia, the usual thing is you melt them down and make some rather horrible sculpture. But you can do all sorts of things like that. And also, there are numbers of, if you like, causes which the FARC can latch onto. And where they do have, the FARC's influence over, of course, one of the difficulties is, the FARC at the moment, in the regions in which they've exercised a long dominion, the FARC do exercise a considerable amount of control over, if you like, social movements and that sort of thing. If it doesn't suit the FARC, then you better not do it. Once they have no longer got the power of threat and punishment, they have to exercise that control in a different way, but they're quite practiced. They're not afraid of elections and things like that. Like all Colombians, they know how to manage elections. It's not that difficult. No? And there would, I think, be a change in the political ambiente. And I think there would, if you like, I think there would be a leftist shift of the whole agenda, political agenda of the country.
I'd like to give the gentleman on the third row, who'd still like to ask you a question.
Just make one or two points. Congratulate Malcolm on a brilliant presentation.
Well, somebody may disagree with that.
And just a few points. The government calculation, and I think it's a sound one, is that with luck, 75 to 80% of the FARC would agree to any deal, and you have to accept that the rest won't, and they become bandits and you hunt them down. On the land issue, which is very complicated, the FARC are actually much closer to what the government is proposing than people realise, and that their presentation is not actually that outlandish. The presence of the army at the talks has been extremely important. It is and will continue to be very important. And I think a recognition on both sides that neither side can win is actually going to help. And this is new. This is different. The FARC didn't go into the talks with a plan. They went into the talks as an experiment to see what was on offer. I think the longer the talks go on, the harder it will be for both sides to maintain discipline.
To do what?
To maintain motivation to continue the fight. But particularly the FARC, because the longer you're talking, the harder it is to keep people going. To a certain extent, that will also apply to the army. But I do believe the longer the talks go on, the more prospect there will be of a solution. As far as the FARC individuals are concerned, yes, they are like us. I once interviewed a FARC defector, and he said to me, where he came from, there was no work, you joined the army or you joined the FARC. And that's the kind of people that they are. And they will have to give the FARC something. Various ideas are bouncing around. One possibility is that you have a series of rural schools that are called peace schools, that the FARC can claim the credit for these. But there's lots of other ideas, but they will have to give them something.
Yeah, I think they'll have to give them quite a lot. I'm partly because the FARC won't say, it has to be something more than the M19 got, for example. Because we are the senior guerrilla. We've been going for longest, and we have all this. But I agree with you entirely, yeah?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I wonder if you could say a word about the electoral calendar. So next year there will be Congress and presidential elections in Colombia. And I think that President Santos has set a deadline to the peace talks, with respect to the oncoming elections. And the deadline is very short, just 10 months away. Do you think the fact that that horizon is short is in the realm of difficulties or in the realm of possibilities?
I honestly don't know. I think it's partly because I'm not a native Colombian. Native Colombians have a sort of built-in electoral calendar, which I don't have. I've read people say, oh yes, there's the calendar, there's the Senate, so. I can't give you an answer about that, because I think so much depends on, I don't know how this is going to develop. I don't think that and I've seen, I have read quite a lot of people who sort of do have this sort of electoral determinism, that it has to be this, or, because of the date of what you say. I don't know. I hope not. I mean, I'm for greater flexibility myself. I am for saying this can't go on forever. But I wouldn't try and, my own inclination is not to tie it too much to the electoral calendar. That seems to me to be a mistake to do that. I think, you know, again, if I was the FARC, I would say that one of the things that would, you know, in my fantasy life as a FARC leader, I'd say one of the things I would like to do is surprise the country and not bore it. The FARC have been very boring for a long time. If, you know, what they would, if I wanted to change, you know, shift my capital, if you like, from the conflict capital to the political capital, I would go fast. Of course, but again, sorry, it always occurs to another aspect. Not all of the FARC leaders have the same political talent. It always turns out that some guerrillas, if you like, are politically more viable than others. And this was very clear with the M19, for example. I don't know. One doesn't know very much about that. Sorry.
Sadly, I'm going to bring things to a halt, but I'm going to take one more question.
Yes. Good evening. Thank you for your talk. I am very surprised not to hear anything about a late news I read last night in the computer, that the talks in Havana had broken down and the FARC was going to start again.
The truce is ended.
Yes.
The FARC declared a Christmas unilateral truce.
Yes.
That is ended, but that doesn't mean the talks are broken down.
And what about, I mean, the figure I read, I was half asleep, the number of hectares they are asking the government of Colombia.
The number of what?
Hectares. The land. Incredible. In the millions that they are asking the government to give to them. And of course, you said that it's not only the government who has to do the agreement, it's also the Colombians who had a tremendous lesson before that they had given to the FARC, the country as big as Switzerland.
Yeah, no, there will not be any more of that. I mean, there will be, you know, there's going to be no demilitarized zone or anything like that. What didn't the truce that the FARC, the unilateral cese de fuego that the FARC announced for Christmas, ended yesterday. But that was not an end to the talks. That was the government said, okay, you have a cese de fuego, we don't believe you. The FARC said, the government says there were 57 violations of the cese de fuego. It's not big news. Well, of course, people sort of think, oh, one of the dilemmas, of course, is that there's a temptation for the guerrillas to show themselves strong in order to keep up the pressure from their side for the talks. If they do that, if they go too far, that makes the talks more difficult because it makes it more difficult for the government to sustain them. Then, you know, they have to dose it. They have to be quite careful about how much violence we use during this process. Too much or too little, you know. But that's a different matter. In the question of the land question, I think one's still in very early days. The FARC have made their pronouncements that they're against the latifundio improductivo, they're against the exceso de ganadería extensiva, etc. But these are all generalities. That has not yet got anywhere near a concrete agreement. And I think there are certainly differences. And again, what the FARC say, outside the discussions is one thing. What goes on in the discussions is probably another thing. The FARC have to keep their end up. They're not going to, you know, some people say, why don't they confess that they still have some sequestrados? And one says, look, you know, people don't go in for confession in this business. It's not, you know, they're not the church. You know, people tell lies. People, they make utterances for for tactical and political reasons. That one just has to accept that's part of the messy world. And nothing is, you know, again, I'm against perfection. What you're going to get out of this isn't going to be in any way perfect, just as the demobilization of the paramilitaries was in no way perfect. But the fact that things are not perfect doesn't mean they're not worth doing.
I'm going to hand the microphone in a moment to former Ambassador Sir Keith Morris to give a vote of thanks to our speaker. But just before I do so, to say that you're very welcome to share a glass of wine with us afterwards, which will be served at the back. And also to say that although we can't give you a definite date yet, we hope to soon announce that the next meeting will be addressed by the author, Tom Filing, who has written amongst a number of books, one called Short Walks from Bogota. But I gather it's rather more extensive and short. It covers various different areas of the country. But we will announce that as soon as we're able to. We'll have something on the website about it. So Keith.
Your chairman has asked me to give this vote of thanks on the grounds that I know Malcolm rather better. But in fact, I've only known Malcolm for 45 years. When I arrived in Bogota in August 1967, he was there on sabbatical. But so I've heard him many times over the years in Bogota, Oxford, London, and so on. And he's dazzled me on many occasions. But I think we can say tonight that we've certainly heard some vintage Deas, and we've had the benefit of the 50 years he's known Colombia and has been studying Colombia, which is coterminous really with this struggle, which we all very much hope is now going to be brought to an end. And nobody from Colombia or from anywhere else has followed it so closely and so deeply as Malcolm has. So I'd like to thank you very, very much on your behalf and mine.